one misconception that I've seen banded around is that, well, polygraph tests, they don't work on psychopaths. They don't feel any remorse, so why would they feel stressed? And this is seemingly not true. So the research isn't exactly settled on the subject, but from what we know, they either experience no different autonomic arousal responses compared to normal people, or they experience elevated levels. That's the sort of range of response that have kind of been illuminated by the research.
Yeah, you're either a Hannibal Lecter, and your blood pressure never rises when you're killing someone, or you're a John Wayne Gacy who is provoked at the very slightest of comments that your character or that your accomplishments are not quite as great as your narcissism thinks. That's actually quite a good way to provoke psychopaths in cracking under pressure when you're giving them a polygraph test, is undermine their elevated sense of confidence.
Yeah. So I found that the idea that they might have an elevated response, which seems to be certainly a sizable amount of the literature on it, which isn't exactly that large. I mean, it's quite a niche area, quite confusing. I'm just like, well, why would someone who doesn't feel empathy or remorse feel have these responses in even higher levels than someone who might? That doesn't make any sense. So I went and looked at lots of the explanations, and I picked out 4 of the prevailing theories as to why there might be a higher response. Of course, it's not established whether this is certain, but this is just speculation. But one of them is that they have a heightened sense of anxiety and fear about being caught when lying, because, of course, they're going to be very aware that they're lying, and they might be worried about themselves. Being high in narcissism, for example, might mean that you're more concerned about your own fate than your crimes, whereas if a non-psychopath committed the same crimes, they might feel more guilty about it, so they might be thinking about themselves less and less about the consequences. So
they have performance anxiety in order that the artifice of guilt or indifference comes across as convincing, and because they're so worried about being convincing because they know they're lying, they will be more stressed going into it. Right.
Another aspect, of course, is the impulsiveness aspect of it, in that you can act impulsively without thinking through the consequences, and therefore it's very difficult to control your responses. And that is one of the main traits of a psychopath, is that they struggle to control how they respond to things. They are impulsive. And then there's one of the obvious ones, in that there's a lack of emotional regulation. They have difficulties regulating their emotions.
I've dated girls like this.
I don't think that's psychopaths. I think that's just women more generally, isn't it? Sorry, ladies.
Passing polygraph tests challenge impossible.
Hey, controlling your emotions isn't an easy thing. In all seriousness, even though I know exactly how to do it, I'm confident doing it, I still can't do it all the time. Sometimes your emotions kind of creep up on you. It's because your unconscious mind is the majority of your psychology. It almost sneaks up behind you, and then you have to remind yourself, yes, actually, I am the one in control.
Yeah, well, also men that say that women's entire worldview is subject to the whims of their fluctuating hormones is forgetting all the times he's been horny. So we are biological animals, you know.
Thanks for lowering the tone, even though that is true.
I'm not trying to lower the tone.
Just inevitably gets that way. So finally, it's just their cognitive style, I suppose you could call it, in that they might have a unique sort of means of cognizing things. For example, a tendency to focus on immediate rewards. So rather than them being worried about punishment, they might feel a reward for getting away with lying,
right,
or telling a lie that isn't pushed back on, and therefore there's still a spike in that they're getting that hit of dopamine, just like, I'm such a good liar.
That makes sense.
So that could possibly be it, because of course you could get a spike for lots of different reasons other than lying, because it is just a series of responses. So if anything's going on in your body, it's going to pick up on it, even if it's not necessarily that you're having a stress response. So that I just thought that this was interesting. It's not necessarily entirely relevant, but there we go. Maybe it's easier to catch a psychopath than it is someone who is not. So there are also lots of other tests that are somewhat in development, I think it's fair to say. There's one which I think is quite a compelling one, which is a measure of cognitive load, which assesses the cognitive load that deception takes place on the liar. So it's trying to look at how maintaining a lie is cognitively demanding, and therefore if you give people other demanding tasks, sustaining the lie makes it very difficult. So that's the basic idea of it. So you could give someone a test where it's testing reaction time, where a subject has to respond to questions as quickly as possible, and with this theory applied to it, with the increased cognitive load of lying, this will slow down their response times, and you'll be able to look at response times as a form of metric as to whether they're telling the truth or not, because if they're telling the truth, they'll be much quicker than if they're telling a lie in their response times, and you can measure that quite accurately to decimal places if you need to. Or you could pose them something like a memory recall task, where they're asked to recall information, and the increased effort of having to lie reduces their recall time as well. And you can compare that to a baseline.
The quicker it is, the more spontaneous, the more likely that it's an integrated and accurate story than just confecting it.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps a more compelling test is one being developed using functional magnetic resonant imaging, or fMRI. This measures changes in blood flow in the brain and can be used to identify patterns in brain activity and which brain areas are being activated. And of course, we haven't established what brain area is associated with lying, but what you can do is associate certain patterns with certain responses and perhaps infer, based on this individual, this is what their brains seem to do when we suspect that they were lying. So it's not perfect yet, but the fMRI machine is quite a good one. I think it, if I remember rightly from my neuroscience lectures, I think it measures the positive ions in oxygen, and it uses magnets to orient them and therefore get a signal from them in your blood. I think that's how it works. I could be misremembering and mixing it up with one of the other ones, because I did learn them all at once, and it is quite easy to do. So in this kind of study, they might be asked to perform a task in which they're asked to answer questions truthfully or to lie about specific information and compare the two. So they're deliberately asking them to lie in these tests, which I think is quite clever in a way, because normally you wouldn't want them to get comfortable with lying, but actually in this test, because they've got basically a map of your brain, you can see the changes in how their brain is actually responding to them lying.
You can establish a physiological pattern.
Exactly. So this seems like something that would be quite fruitful. Imagine this once it's reliable in the hands of a government, for example. Well, terrifying stuff, isn't it? There's also electroencephalography, or EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain and can be used to identify changes in brainwave patterns that are associated with deception. This can either take, you can either visualize it in a similar way to fMRI, or you can have it more similarly to the actual polygraph test readout, where you have the lines on the screen. And when I've been had my brain measured with EEG, it's been the lines on the screen, which is still useful data, and I've been able to have it on my head and look at the computer at the same time and be able to see my interest kind of peak on the actual computer screen at the fact I'm looking at it. So it was a bit meta, but I was just like, oh, I can see my own reaction to the screen on the screen. But something that I very much recommend doing. I think most psychology labs actually take volunteers. I used to get paid. So one of my first ever jobs was being a guinea pig when I was like 16, 17 at the university. And because I wasn't a student and I was actually on the younger side, I was actually quite a valuable participant. So I was making things like £8 an hour, and this was not bad money.
Yeah.
That was well above minimum wage at the time.
Yeah, I was working for £5 an hour at 16, so I should have just been strapped in some mad scientist's chair.
I did have it before where I went into an EEG study, and they have to put this goo in your hair to make it electrically conductive. And they're like, "Oh, sorry, our sink's broken." And I was going to the pub to meet my friends. I wasn't.
Like Simon from The Inbetweeners.
Yeah, so I had all of this electrical gel in my hair. I've just outed myself as going to the pub when I was underage, but yeah, I'm too old.
He was having a carvery. That's fine.
I was actually getting food, not a carvery. But there's also eye tracking. This is one of the more developed technologies, which just measure changes in eye movement, such as gaze direction and pupil dilation, which is associated with deception. And I've taken part in eye tracking experiments myself, as well as knowing quite well how they work. And the eye tracking data is really, really good. So I've spoke to professors who've been looking at things like infant eye tracking and showing what shapes they're drawn to, and they basically realise that even before they can learn to speak, their faces are directed to their eyes are directed to things that are shaped like human-like faces. They might not even, directly resemble a face. It might be two dots and a line in like a little smiley face pattern, and that it'll still be directed towards that, which has been used to suggest that an infant's propensity to look at human faces is an innate skill, because they haven't had the time yet to be socialized into it. And you can make these conclusions by looking at things like eye tracking.
The really interesting ones that I've seen is, so I know there was this trend on Twitch and YouTube for a while of where guys were using the eye tracking software, and they had the challenge to not look at attractive women. Some of the
challenge impossible,
exactly,
having the title.
Yeah, some of the brain imaging corresponding to that has been really interesting to look at, because the guys that are looking at attractive women and also wearing the EEG set, their brains light up in similar ways to similar body types to blind men drawing the ideal body type. So even though they may never have seen it, they draw the ideal proportions, and their brain lights up in the same way as guys looking directly at attractive, curvaceous women. So that also indicates that there is some sort of innate, non-socialized attraction to fertility markers in women in human males.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's undeniable at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, but as long as you're not a feminist, then
that's true.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.